Lady Valus stood alone in the highest tower of her crystal palace and watched the three suns of the Andromeda sector paint the sky in shades of purple and gold, and her long silver hair moved gently in the evening breeze that carried the scent of starflowers from the gardens far below. And she felt the familiar presence of her two dragons before she saw them as Ember and Frost glided through the air toward her landing on the wide balcony, with the grace that only ancient creatures possessed, and their scales caught the fading light, creating patterns of fire and ice across the polished floor. Ember was the larger of the two, with crimson scales that seemed to hold actual flames beneath their surface. And when he breathed, the air shimmered with heat, and his eyes were molten gold, and they held an intelligence that surpassed most sentient beings in the galaxy. And Frost was smaller, but no less magnificent, with scales like carved diamonds that reflected light in 1,000 directions, and her breath could freeze metal in seconds, and her eyes were the pale blue of winter skies. And together they had been Valus companions for over 300 years, since she found them as hatchlings in the volcanic caves of Draken Prime. Valus reached out and touched Ember's massive head, feeling the warmth radiating from his scales, and through their telepathic bond, she felt his concern for her troubled mind, and she tried to project calmness, but the dragons knew her too well, and Frost nuzzled against her other hand, sending waves of cool comfort through the connection, and Valus whispered that she was fine, even though all three of them knew it was not entirely true, because the memory that haunted her thoughts would not fade, no matter how many years passed. 3 cycles ago she had made a decision that still kept her awake during the long nights when the palace was silent, and the stars seemed to judge her from above, and she had banished a human named Jake Morrison from her kingdom. And at the time it seemed not just right but necessary, because the Galactic Council had declared humans to be a dangerous species, and their presence in elven territories was forbidden under penalty of severe sanctions, and Valus had her people to protect, and her duty as their leader demanded she follow council law, even when her heart whispered that something about the decision felt wrong. Jake had arrived in her kingdom by accident when his small exploration vessel suffered catastrophic engine failure near the border of elven space, and her patrol ships found him drifting in a damaged escape pod, and they brought him to the palace because protocol demanded that all survivors be given medical attention regardless of species. And Valus remembered the first time she saw him carried into the healing chambers unconscious and covered in burns from the pod malfunction, and the healers worked for 3 days to save his life using their most advanced medical magic and techniques. When Jake finally woke, he was confused and disoriented, and he kept asking about his crew members, but his ship had been completely destroyed in the explosion, and he was the only survivor, and Valus visited him in the healing chambers, against the advice of her council members who said humans could not be trusted, and she found herself drawn to his resilience and the way he refused to give up hope even when told his friends were gone, and he spoke with such passion about exploring the unknown regions of space and discovering new worlds that she found herself smiling for the first time in months. The council pressured her daily to send the human away, and they cited countless regulations and ancient laws that forbade humans from remaining in elven territory, and they spoke of humans as if they were barely civilized barbarians who had only recently achieved space travel and posed a threat to the established order of the galaxy. And Valus knew the council feared change more than any actual danger humans might present, but she also knew her position as leader meant making difficult choices and putting her people's welfare above her personal feelings. Jake recovered fully after 2 weeks, and during that time Valus found excuses to visit the healing chambers more often than necessary, and they talked about everything from the nature of consciousness to the best way to prepare traditional human foods. And Jake had a curiosity about elven culture that most species lacked, and he asked genuine questions about their magic system and their connection to nature and their long lifespans, and Valus found herself answering with an honesty she rarely showed to outsiders, and Ember and Frost took an unusual interest in the human, often visiting his chambers and allowing him to touch their scales, which they permitted for almost no one outside their bonded mistress. But the council ultimatum came on the 15th day, and they gathered in the Grand Throne room with representatives from 12 elven houses, and they demanded that Valus exile the human immediately, or face a vote of no confidence that could remove her from power, and she stood before them feeling the weight of centuries of tradition and responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. and she looked at their stern faces and saw fear masquerading as wisdom, and she knew that fighting them would tear her kingdom apart from within and weaken them all. She summoned Jake to the throne room, and he came dressed in the simple clothes her servants had provided, and he looked so small, standing before the assembled council members and their cold, judgmental stares, and Valis felt her heart breaking as she spoke the formal words of banishment, and she told him he had one day to leave elven space and he was forbidden from ever returning under penalty of death. And she saw the hurt and confusion in his eyes, because they had formed a connection during those 2 weeks, and he could not understand why she was turning against him so suddenly. Jake asked why, and his voice was quiet but steady, and he said he thought they were friends, and Valis wanted to scream that they were. But instead she maintained her formal composure, and said that council law was absolute and humans were not permitted in elven territories, and she could not make exceptions, even for those she had come to respect. And Jake looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded with dignity that surprised the council members, and he said he understood duty, and he would leave as commanded, and he asked only that she remember him kindly, and not as an enemy. The next morning, Valis watched from her tower as Jake's small vessel lifted off from the palace landing platform and disappeared into the stars, and she felt Ember and Frost distress through their bond, because the dragons had sensed something special about the human, and they did not understand why their mistress sent him away. And for 3 days after Frost refused to eat, and Ember flew angry patterns through the sky, scorching clouds with his fire breath, and Valis spent those days locked in her chambers, wondering if she had made the right choice, or if she had sacrificed something precious on the altar of political necessity. Months passed, and then years, and Valis threw herself into ruling her kingdom with renewed focus, and she negotiated trade agreements and settled disputes between noble houses and expanded the Crystal Palace to include new wings for visiting dignitaries, and she did everything a good leader should do. But at night, when she stood on her balcony watching the stars, she wondered where Jake had gone and whether he had found a new home among the outer colonies, and whether he hated her for the exile, and the wondering never stopped. No matter how much time went by, the Galactic Council continued to spread their narrative about humans being primitive and potentially dangerous, and they pointed to small incidents where human colonies had conflicts with other species over resources or territory, and they used these isolated cases to justify their blanket restrictions. And Valis attended the council meetings and listened to the debates, and she noticed that most council members had never actually met a human, and their fears were based entirely on prejudice and ancient propaganda. But she said nothing because she had already made her choice, and speaking against the council now would only make her look weak and indecisive. Ember and Frost grew increasingly restless as time passed, and they flew longer patrols around the kingdom, and sometimes disappeared for days at a time exploring distant moons and asteroid fields, and when they returned, they seemed dissatisfied, as if searching for something they could not find, and Valis understood their feelings, because she felt the same emptiness, and she wondered if exiling Jake had created a wound that would never fully heal, and whether the price of political stability was worth the cost to her soul. Her most trusted advisor, Commander Lyra, noticed the change in her mistress, and one evening, she asked if Valis regretted the decision about the human, and Valis considered lying. But Lyra had served her for over a century and deserved honesty, and she admitted that yes, she regretted it every single day, and she wondered what Jake might have taught them about human culture and technology if given the chance. And Lyra said that perhaps regret was the price leaders paid for making difficult choices, but that did not mean the choices were wrong, and Valis appreciated the comfort, even though it did not ease the ache in her heart. 3 years after the exile, Valis received reports of unusual activity in the outer sectors, and explorers were finding abandoned settlements and ships drifting without crews, and the few survivors who were rescued spoke of seeing strange shadows in space and hearing voices that drove people mad, and the council dismissed these reports as superstition and the result of isolation sickness that affected those who spent too long in deep space. But Valis felt a growing unease because Valis stood frozen in her private chambers staring at the communication crystal, as if it had suddenly transformed into something dangerous, and the name Jake Morrison echoed through her mind, bringing with it 3 years of accumulated guilt and regret and wonder about what had become of him. And now he was here requesting an audience, and she had to decide whether to grant it or turn him away again. And the thought of rejecting him a second time made her physically ill. But duty and caution whispered that she should be careful, because 3 years was a long time and people changed, especially when they had been wronged. She told Commander Lyra to maintain full alert status and keep all defense systems active, but to allow the human vessel to approach the palace and not to fire unless directly threatened. And Lyra acknowledged the orders, but her expression showed concern, because allowing a potentially hostile ship into their inner system went against standard protocols, and Velis understood the risk, but something deep inside her said that Jake had not returned seeking violence, and she had learned over her long life to trust her instincts even when logic suggested otherwise. Ember and Frost appeared at her chamber entrance as if summoned by her turbulent thoughts, and they pushed through the doorway with urgency, and their emotions flooded through the bond, carrying a mixture of excitement and anticipation, and something else she could not quite identify. And Ember let out a low rumble that rattled the crystal windows, and Frost circled Velis with nervous energy. And the dragons clearly remembered Jake, and they wanted to see him again, and their reaction told Velis more than any logical analysis could about whether the returning human posed a real threat. She dressed carefully, choosing formal robes that represented her position as kingdom leader, but selecting colors that were less severe than the council required for official functions, and she wore the crystalline pendant that had been passed down through 40 generations of elven rulers, and it held ancient magic that could protect her from most forms of attack. And she checked her appearance in the mirror and saw an elven woman who had ruled for 3 centuries but who suddenly felt as uncertain as a youth facing their first diplomatic meeting. And she took a deep breath and centered herself and reminded herself that she was Lady Velis, and this was her kingdom, and she would face whatever came with dignity. The throne room was already filling with council members and noble house representatives when she arrived, because word had spread quickly about the human ship, and everyone wanted to see what would happen, and some faces showed hostility while others merely showed curiosity, and a few showed barely concealed fear. And Velis took her place on the crystal throne, and Ember and Frost positioned themselves on either side, and their presence alone was enough to quiet the murmuring conversations and establish that this meeting would proceed under her control, and no one else. Commander Lyra entered through the main doors and announced that the human vessel had docked at the palace platform, and that Jake Morrison was approaching the throne room with an escort of palace guards, and Velis felt her pulse quicken, and she gripped the arms of her throne and forced her expression to remain neutral and composed. And she would not show weakness before her council or her people, and she would not reveal that her heart was racing with emotions she had spent 3 years trying to suppress. The grand doors opened, and Jake Morrison walked through, and Velis almost gasped, because he looked nothing like the broken explorer she had banished 3 years ago, and his simple clothes had been replaced by what appeared to be advanced armor that pulsed with soft blue light and energy signatures her sensors could not fully identify, and his posture radiated confidence instead of the humble uncertainty he had shown before. And his eyes met hers across the distance of the throne room, and in that moment she saw something that made her breath catch, because this was not a man seeking revenge, and this was not a man who had been broken by exile, and this was someone who had found himself in the years of wandering. Jake walked forward with measured steps, and the palace guards flanked him, but she noticed they seemed tense, as if uncertain whether they could actually stop him if he chose to act against orders. And he stopped at the appropriate distance from the throne and bowed with perfect formal courtesy. And then he spoke in flawless ancient Elvish, which should have been impossible, because humans were not supposed to be capable of learning the sacred language that required centuries to master. And the council members gasped and whispered, and some even stood from their seats in shock. He said that he greeted Lady Velis in the name of friendship and in memory of kindness she had shown him during his time of need, and he thanked her for allowing him to return to her kingdom, even though he understood he had been banished, and his presence here violated the terms of that exile. And he said he would not have come unless the matter was of such importance that it superseded personal grievances and old wounds, and he carried news that would affect not just the elven kingdoms, but the entire galactic civilization. And he asked for permission to speak freely before the assembled council. Velis felt dozens of eyes watching her, waiting to see how she would respond, and she could sense the council members hoping she would reject him immediately and send him away. But she had not spent 3 years wondering about Jake Morrison only to turn him away now without hearing what he had to say, and she gestured for him to continue and granted him temporary immunity from the banishment decree for the duration of this meeting, and several council members objected loudly, but she silenced them with a look that reminded everyone exactly who ruled this kingdom. Jake thanked her, and then he began to speak, and his voice carried clearly through the throne room, without needing amplification. And he told them that during his 3 years of exile he had traveled to the furthest reaches of known space and beyond, into regions that appeared on no galactic maps, and he had been searching for answers about human origins because the Galactic Council official history claimed humans were newcomers to space travel and had only achieved faster-than-light capability in the last few centuries. But Jake had always felt that story was incomplete. He explained that he found ruins on dead worlds in uncharted systems, and these ruins were ancient beyond measure and covered in symbols and writing that no current civilization could read. And he spent months studying them, and gradually he began to understand that the symbols were not actually alien, and they were a protoform of human language that had evolved over millions of years, and the ruins themselves responded to his presence in ways they did not respond to other species. And doors opened for him, and systems activated at his touch, and he realized these were human structures built by human hands in an age before recorded history. The council members erupted in protest and accusations, and they called him a liar and a fraud, and they said he was spreading human propaganda to elevate his species above their proper place in the galactic order. And the oldest council member, Lord Theron, demanded proof and said that wild claims required extraordinary evidence, and Jake simply smiled and reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew a small crystalline device, and he activated it. And suddenly the entire throne room filled with holographic images. The images showed cities floating in space and structures so massive they made planets look small by comparison, and beings that looked human moving through these cities with technology that seemed indistinguishable from magic. And there were ships that could cross galaxies in moments, and weapons that could move stars and reshape. Reality itself and the recordings were not artistic interpretations or simulations, and they were actual preserved footage from millions of years ago showing a human civilization at the height of power that current galactic civilization could not even begin to match. Velas leaned forward in her throne and studied the images carefully, and her centuries of experience told her these were genuine and not fabrications, and she saw details in the architecture and technology that matched the few fragments of ancient ruins that elven archaeologists had found over the millennia, and always dismissed as belonging to unknown extinct species. And she felt a chill run through her, because if Jake was telling the truth, then everything the Galactic Council had taught about the history and hierarchy of civilization was built on lies and ignorance. Jake continued his explanation and said that the ancient human civilization had ruled the galaxy for millions of years, and they had been wise and generally benevolent, and they helped primitive species develop and protected the galaxy from threats beyond known space. But then something happened, and a catastrophic event that human records called the Great Silence, and in a matter of decades the entire civilization collapsed, and the surviving humans were reduced to primitive tribes scattered across a single planet called Earth, and they had to rebuild from nothing, and all memory of their glorious past was lost, except in myths and legends. Velas descended from her throne and walked toward Jake, and the council members murmured in surprise because protocol demanded she remain seated during formal audiences, but she felt this moment required more than protocol, and she needed to look him in the eyes and see the truth without the distance of ceremony between them. And as she approached, she noticed details she had missed from afar, and his armor was not just pulsing with light but actually responding to his emotional state, and the patterns shifted when he looked at her, and she wondered what emotions were driving those changes. She stopped an arm's length away and studied his face, and she saw the weight of knowledge in his eyes and the burden of responsibility that came from knowing something terrible was approaching and being one of the few people who could warn others. And she recognized that weight, because she carried it herself every day as ruler of her kingdom. And she asked him why he came to her specifically, and why not go directly to the Galactic Council with this information, and surely they had more resources to verify his claims and mount a defense. Jake smiled sadly and said that he had tried approaching the council 3 months ago, and they refused to even grant him an audience, and they dismissed his messages as human propaganda. And when he attempted to present evidence to their security forces, they threatened to imprison him for spreading false information and panic. And he realized the council would never listen because accepting the truth meant admitting they had been wrong about humans for centuries, and institutional pride was often stronger than survival instinct. And so he needed someone with authority, who might actually listen, and someone who had shown him kindness once even though duty forced her to send him away. Bayless felt shame wash over her, because she realized the council had already doomed billions of beings by refusing to hear the warning, and their prejudice against humans might cost the entire galaxy its future. And she turned back to face the assembled nobles and council representatives, and she saw fear and doubt on their faces, and some were already preparing to reject Jake's claims, because accepting them meant facing an enemy they could not comprehend, and change was always harder than denial. Lord Theron stood and demanded to know what proof Jake had beyond ancient recordings that could be fabricated, and he said that showing images of dead civilizations was not the same as proving a current threat existed, and Jake had not demonstrated any evidence of these supposed devourers, except fear-mongering and convenient warnings, and several other council members nodded in agreement, and Violas felt frustration building because she could see they were looking for any excuse to dismiss what they had heard. Jake reached into his pouch again and withdrew what looked like a simple black stone, and he held it up and asked if anyone recognized it, and the council members stared blankly. But Commander Lyra gasped and stepped forward, and she said that object looked like the void fragments her patrol ships had been finding in the outer sectors over the past 6 months, and they had recovered dozens of them from abandoned settlements and drifting vessels, and analysis showed they were not made of any known matter, and they seemed to absorb all energy directed at them. Jake nodded and said that the void fragments were calling cards, and the devourers sent them ahead like scouts, and they infected an area with their presence, and gradually reality itself began to break down around them, and living beings exposed to them for too long experienced madness, and eventually dissolution. And the fragments were the reason settlements were being found empty, and why ships' crews vanished, and the disappearances in the outer sectors that everyone had been dismissing as accidents or pirates were actually the first signs that the devourers were approaching. He said that according to ancient records, the void fragments would continue appearing with increasing frequency, and the affected zones would grow larger and spread inward toward populated systems, and within a few years, entire planets would be lost, and within a decade the devourers themselves would arrive, and by then it would be too late to mount any meaningful defense, and the galaxy would follow the path of the ancient human civilization into extinction, unless action was taken immediately. Veilis asked what action could be taken, and what defense existed against entities that could dissolve reality itself. And Jake said that the ancient humans had developed weapons specifically designed to fight the devourers, and these weapons were not based on conventional physics but rather on manipulating the fundamental forces that held existence together, and they required massive amounts of power and coordination across multiple systems, and most importantly, they required genetic keys from several ancient species to activate, because the weapons were deliberately designed so that no single species could use them alone. He explained that humans were one key, because the weapons were built by human hands and encoded with human genetic markers, but the ancient humans had been wise enough to know that power concentrated in one species led to corruption and tyranny, and so they created the weapons to require cooperation. And elves were another key, because elven magic was not actually magic at all but rather a biological ability to manipulate quantum fields, and that ability came from another ancient civilization that had merged with early elven ancestors millions of years ago, and together humans and elves could unlock the first level of the ancient weapons. Veilis felt her mind reeling, because this revelation about elven magic being biological technology from another civilization contradicted everything her people believed about their spiritual connection to nature and the universe, and she asked how Jake knew this, and he said it was all recorded in the ancient ruins, and the humans who built the defense network had documented everything, including the origins and capabilities of the other ancient species they had allied with, and elves were specifically mentioned as partners and friends and equals in the fight against the darkness. Lord Theron stood again, and his voice was sharp with anger, and he said this was clearly a human trick to gain access to elven secrets and technology, and Jake was weaving an elaborate lie about ancient threats to manipulate them into lowering their defenses and sharing their most guarded knowledge. And humans had always been ambitious and greedy, and this was just another example of their species trying to rise above their station through deception and manipulation. Jake turned to face Lord Theron directly, and his expression was calm, but his voice carried an edge of steel, and he said that if he wanted to attack the elven kingdoms, he would not have come alone in a single ship to face an entire court of hostile nobles, and he would have used the technology he had already unlocked to simply take what he wanted, because the ancient human weapons he had access to could level this entire palace in seconds and turn the planet itself into dust. But he came seeking alliance, not conquest, because the Devourers did not care about species politics or territorial disputes, and they would consume humans and elves and every other civilization with equal indifference. The throne room fell silent, and Valus could see that Jake was telling the truth, and the casual way he mentioned having the power to destroy her planet was not a boast but a simple statement of fact, and she realized he had been showing restraint by coming here diplomatically when he could have simply forced cooperation through threats, and that restraint told her more about his character than any words could, and she made a decision in that moment that would change everything. She turned to face Lord Theron and the other council members, and she said that she believed Jake Morrison, and she was choosing to trust that his warning was genuine, and his offer of alliance was sincere, and she understood this meant potentially defying the Galactic Council and risking sanctions against her kingdom. But the alternative was sitting idle while an existential threat approached, and she would not be the ruler who chose political comfort over survival. And she asked Jake what he needed from her and her people. Jake's visible relief showed that he had not been certain she would agree, and he said that first they needed to verify his claims by visiting one of the ancient weapons sites, and he knew the location of a facility 3 days' flight from here, and it was hidden inside a rogue planet drifting through deep space, and elven quantum manipulation abilities combined with his genetic access would allow them to enter and activate the basic systems. And once the council saw proof that the weapons were real, they might be convinced to take the threat seriously. Valus agreed immediately and said she would accompany him personally, along with Ember and Frost and Commander Lyra, and a small security team, and Lord Theron protested, saying it was madness for the kingdom ruler to go on such a dangerous mission based on the word of an exiled human. But Valus cut him off and reminded him that she had ruled for 3 centuries, and she did not need his permission to make decisions about her own safety. And if the threat was real, then seeing it firsthand was the only way she could effectively lead the response. The hidden planet loomed before them, and its surface was darker than space itself, and the geometric patterns covering it seemed to shift and change, as if alive, and Valus felt an instinctive revulsion looking at it, and through her bond with Ember and Frost she sensed the dragons were experiencing the same reaction, and this place felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger, and everything to do with something much deeper and more fundamental. And Jake explained that the facility was designed to be hidden from all conventional sensors and scanning methods, and only someone carrying ancient human genetic markers could reveal its location. The ships approached slowly, and Commander Lyra ran every scan available, but the readings made no sense, and the planet registered as both solid matter and empty space simultaneously, and energy signatures fluctuated between impossible extremes, and the navigational computer kept insisting they were looking at nothing even, though everyone could clearly see the planet through the viewports, and Jake said this was normal, and the ancient humans had built the facility using technology that operated outside standard physical laws, and approaching it always felt disorienting, until your mind adjusted to the contradictions. They found a landing platform that appeared when Jake transmitted a specific sequence from his ship, and the platform was large enough for both vessels and Ember and Frost, who landed with visible reluctance, and their scales dimmed as if the planet itself was suppressing their natural fire and ice. And Valus felt their discomfort and sent waves of reassurance through their bond, and reminded them that they were together, and nothing would separate them. And the dragons pressed close to her as they prepared to exit the ships. The atmosphere outside was breathable according to sensors, but it tasted strange and metallic, and the gravity was slightly heavier than comfortable, and the geometric patterns on the ground pulsed with faint light that followed no rhythm Velas could identify. And Jake led them toward what appeared to be a seamless wall, and he placed his hand against it and spoke words in ancient human language. And the wall simply dissolved, revealing a corridor that stretched into darkness, and he gestured for them to follow. And Velas walked beside him, while Ember and Frost squeezed through the entrance behind them, and the security team fanned out in defensive formation. The corridor was wide enough for the dragons, and it was lined with symbols that glowed brighter as Jake passed them, and the walls themselves seemed to be made of a material that was simultaneously metal and crystal, and something else entirely, and Velas reached out to touch one wall and felt a vibration that went beyond physical sensation, and it resonated with something deep inside her. And she realized this was what Jake meant about elven quantum manipulation abilities, and the facility was responding to her presence just as it responded to his. They walked for what felt like hours, though. Her internal chronometer insisted only 20 minutes had passed, and time itself seemed flexible in this place, and finally they emerged into a vast chamber that defied comprehension, and the ceiling was so high it disappeared into darkness, and the floor was covered with platforms and structures that formed patterns she could almost understand, but not quite. And in the center was a sphere of light so bright it hurt to look at directly, and yet somehow did not illuminate the surrounding darkness, and Jake said this was the heart of the facility, and the core of one of the ancient weapons. He approached the sphere and gestured for Velas to join him, and he explained that activating the weapon required both human genetic authorization and elven quantum field manipulation, and he would provide the first, and she would provide the second, and together they could bring the system online and prove to her council that everything he said was true. And Velas felt nervousness because she had never attempted anything like this, and her quantum manipulation training was focused on healing and enhancement, and not interfacing with ancient technology. Jake sensed her hesitation, and he said that the facility would guide her, and the ancient humans who built it understood that future generations might not have complete knowledge, and they designed the systems to teach and assist their users, and all she needed to do was open herself to the connection and let her natural abilities flow. And Velas took a deep breath and centered herself the way her meditation teachers had instructed centuries ago, and she reached out with both hands and touched the sphere at the same moment Jake did. The effect was immediate and overwhelming, and her consciousness exploded outward, and suddenly she could perceive things she had never imagined possible, and she felt the quantum fields that held reality together, and they were like strings of light connecting everything to everything else, and she understood in that moment why her people called it magic, because there were no adequate words in any language to describe what she was experiencing, and she felt Jake's presence beside her, solid and steady, and together they were unlocking something that had been dormant for millions of years. Images flooded her mind, and she saw the ancient human civilization at its height, and cities that spanned entire solar systems, and beings of pure thought and consciousness, living alongside physical bodies, and art and science merged into something transcendent. And then she saw the Devourers' arrival, and they came from the spaces between galaxies where physics broke down. And they were not creatures in any conventional sense, but rather absences and voids that consumed light and matter and thought. And everything they touched simply ceased to exist. And the ancient humans fought them with courage and determination. But ultimately they were losing because the Devourers could not be killed in any meaningful sense, and they could only be driven back temporarily. She saw the weapon systems being built and entire planets converted into energy collectors, and star systems reconfigured to channel power, and the most brilliant minds of hundreds of species working together to create something that could push back against the void. And the weapons worked, but at terrible cost, and using them required sacrificing entire civilizations' worth of energy. And the ancient humans made the choice to use them anyway, because the alternative was extinction, and they drove the Devourers back beyond the galactic rim and bought millions of years of peace, but they knew the enemy would return. The vision faded, and Velas found herself back in the chamber, gasping for breath, and Jake was supporting her because her legs had given out at some point and she did not remember falling, and the sphere in the center of the room was now pulsing with steady light, and systems all around them were activating, and displays appeared showing star charts and energy readings and tactical information, and Commander Lyra and the security team were staring in awe because the facility had come alive and was responding to their presence. Jake helped Vela stand, and he asked if she was all right, and she nodded, though her hands were shaking, and she said she understood now, and she had seen what he had seen, and she knew the threat was real, and they needed to act immediately because the timeline was even shorter than he had told the Council, and the void fragments appearing in the outer sectors indicated the Devourers were closer than anyone realized, and they had perhaps 5 years instead of 10 before the main force arrived. She turned to Commander Lyra and ordered her to record everything in the chamber and take as many readings as possible because they would need this evidence to convince the Galactic Council, and Lyra immediately began coordinating with the technical team, and they deployed scanning equipment and started documenting the facility, and Ember and Frost approached the sphere cautiously and sniffed at it. And then something unexpected happened, and the dragons began to glow with inner light, and through her bond, Velas felt them connecting to the facility in their own way. Jake looked surprised, and he said that according to the records, dragons were not listed as one of the key species, but clearly the facility was recognizing them as something important. And Velas felt through her bond that Ember and Frost were accessing information directly, and they were learning about the ancient weapons and the Devourers in the coming war, and she realized her dragons were far more intelligent than even she had understood, and they had simply never had reason to reveal the full depth of their consciousness before this moment. The facility displays began showing new information, and it appeared the dragons were unlocking additional systems that neither Jake nor Velas could access alone, and Jake studied the readings with growing excitement, and he said, "This changed everything, because if dragons could interface with the weapons, then the defense network was more powerful than he had calculated, and dragons existed on dozens of worlds throughout the galaxy, and if they could be brought into the Alliance, then the chances of survival increased dramatically." Velas asked the facility directly through her quantum connection what role dragons played in the ancient war, and the answer came not in words, but in more visions. And she saw dragons fighting alongside ancient humans and elves, and they were not pets or servants but equals and partners, and their ability to exist partially outside normal physics made them ideal for combating the Devourers, and the ancient records showed dragons sacrificing themselves to close void rifts, and their fire and ice were not just elemental powers, but manifestations of fundamental forces that could counteract the dissolution effect of the Devourers. The space around Velas' kingdom transformed into a tense standoff, and her defense fleet positioned themselves between the palace and the Council armada, and both sides had weapons charged and shields raised, but no one had fired yet, and the hour deadline General Caney gave her was ticking down with agonizing slowness, and Velas stood on her command bridge with Jake beside her and Ember and Frost circling the palace outside, and through her bond she could feel their readiness to fight, and their absolute loyalty to her regardless of the cost. Commander Lyra reported that allied kingdoms were responding to her call, and ships were already entering the system from 3 directions, but they were outnumbered 5 to 1, and a direct battle would be devastating even if they won, and Velas knew she had to find another way, and she could not let this escalate into a war that would weaken everyone right when they needed unity most. And she asked Jake if there was any way to demonstrate the threat quickly and force the Council to pay attention. Jake thought for a moment, and then his eyes widened, and he said there was one option, but it was risky, and if it went wrong, they might make everything worse. And he explained that the facility they visited had given him access to detection systems that could locate void fragments, and he could activate a scan that would reveal every fragment currently in the galaxy and project the results for everyone to see. And the sheer number and spread of the contamination might be enough to shock the Council into listening. Velas told him to do it, and Jake pulled out the small device he had used to reveal the hidden planet, and he interfaced it with the ship sensors and began transmitting commands using authorization codes from the ancient facility, and for several seconds nothing happened. And then every ship in the system received simultaneous data packets, and their sensors began displaying information they had never been configured to detect, and suddenly the void fragments became visible on everyone's tactical displays. The effect was immediate and horrifying, and the fragments appeared as black dots scattered throughout the sector, and there were thousands of them and more appearing every second, and the pattern showed they were spreading inward from the galactic rim in a wave that was slowly but steadily consuming space, and several ships in General Caney fleet were actually inside contaminated zones without knowing it, and the readings showed their crews were already being affected, and madness and dissolution were starting to take hold. General Caney's voice came over the communication channel, and for the first time he sounded uncertain, and he demanded to know what kind of trick this was and what Jake had done to their sensors, and Valus responded that it was not a trick, but reality, and the void fragments were real, and they had been spreading for months, and the Council refusal to listen had allowed the contamination to reach this far, and she was transmitting the full evidence package from the ancient facility, and every ship in the system would receive proof that Jake had been telling the truth. The communication channels erupted with voices, and ship captains reported crew members experiencing symptoms and strange behavior, and one vessel went dark completely, and its last transmission was a scream that cut off mid-sound, and General Caney ordered his fleet to pull back from the contaminated zones, and suddenly the military standoff became secondary to the immediate crisis, and ships scrambled to avoid the spreading darkness. Valus seized the moment, and she broadcast on all frequencies that this was the threat Jake had warned about, and the Devourers were coming, and the void fragments were just the beginning. And if the galactic species did not unite immediately, then everyone would die. And she demanded an emergency council session. And she said Jake would present evidence and solutions, and the council could either listen or they could watch their civilizations crumble while they debated politics. General Caney was silent for a long moment, and then he responded that he was contacting the High Council and recommending they hear Jake testimony, and his voice had lost its arrogant certainty and been replaced by genuine fear, and Valus felt a grim satisfaction, because sometimes fear was the only thing that could cut through bureaucratic stubbornness and make people see clearly. Within hours, the High Council agreed to an emergency session, and they authorized a gathering of representatives from every species at the neutral station that orbited between 3 star systems, and Valus prepared to travel there with Jake and a full diplomatic delegation, and she brought Ember and Frost because she wanted the council to see that dragons were part of this alliance, and their presence would add weight to her testimony. The council chamber was enormous and designed to accommodate representatives from 300 species, and the architecture was deliberately neutral, with no species given preferential positioning, and Valus walked in with Jake at her side, and her dragons flanking them and the assembled representatives fell silent, and many had never seen dragons before, and the sight of 2 ancient beings of fire and ice walking calmly through their halls was enough to command respect. High Arbiter Zin presided over the session, and she was an ancient being from a species that existed primarily as energy patterns, and her voice resonated through everyone's mind simultaneously, and she called the session to order and acknowledged that unusual circumstances had forced this emergency gathering, and she invited Lady Valus and Jake Morrison to present their evidence, and she warned that false testimony would result in severe penalties. Jake stepped forward and activated his holographic projectors, and the chamber filled with images from the ancient facility, and he spoke calmly and clearly and laid out everything he had discovered about human origins and the ancient civilization and the Devourers and the weapon systems designed to fight them, and he showed recordings of the void fragments spreading and demonstrated their effects, and he presented mathematical projections showing that within 5 years the contamination would reach core worlds, and within 10 years the Devourers themselves would arrive. The council members listened in growing horror, and several demanded to know why they had not been informed sooner, and Jake said bluntly that he had tried 3 months ago and been turned away and dismissed as a liar, and if the council had listened, then they would have had more time to prepare, and Valus added that institutional prejudice against humans had nearly doomed the galaxy, and it was time to put aside old biases and face reality high. Arbiter Zin asked what solutions existed, and Jake explained the ancient weapon network and the requirement for genetic keys from multiple species, and he said humans and elves could activate the first level, but full power required contributions from at least 7 ancient species, and he had identified 5 others. Based on the facility records, and dragons were an unexpected addition that significantly increased their chances. A representative from the Kryn Empire stood and demanded proof that these weapons would work, and said they were being asked to trust ancient technology that might not function. And Jake responded that the weapons were already functioning, and he demonstrated by activating a small defense field around himself, using the device from his wrist, and the field absorbed several shots from security weapons without any visible effort, and he said this was the lowest power setting, and the full weapons could reshape star systems. The debate lasted for hours, and Valus watched as the council slowly came to accept the reality of their situation, and resistance crumbled under the weight of evidence, and eventually, High Arbiter Zinn called for a vote to establish a united defense coalition and authorize whatever resources were necessary to activate the ancient weapon network, and the vote passed with overwhelming majority, and only the most stubborn holdouts voting against Valus and Jake were named co-commanders of the coalition and given authority to coordinate across all species and territories, and their first task was to visit the other key species and convince them to contribute their genetic markers and knowledge. And Valus felt the weight of this responsibility but also hope, because for the first time, the galaxy was truly united against a common threat over. The following months they traveled to dozens of worlds and met with leaders and elders and slowly built the alliance. And the Dragon homeworlds agreed to help after their eldest members confirmed they remembered the ancient war, and they sent warriors to join the coalition, and other ancient species contributed their unique abilities and knowledge, and the weapon network began coming online. System by system, Ember and Frost became ambassadors of sorts, and their presence helped convince skeptical dragons that the threat was real, and Valus watched her companions grow into roles she had never imagined for them. And through her bond, she felt their pride and purpose and their determination to protect not just her, but the entire galaxy. Jake spent his time coordinating the technical aspects and training teams to operate the ancient systems, and Valus handled the political challenges and kept the coalition unified when old rivalries threatened to tear it apart, and they worked together with a synchronization that came from mutual respect and shared purpose, and somewhere along the way, their professional partnership deepened into genuine friendship and perhaps something more, though neither spoke of it openly.